Hey everyone, welcome back to the Satisfied Philosophy. Today I'm with the philosopher Joshua Sijuwade. I'm going to go ahead and explain who he is, and then we're going to have a discussion concerning his recent essay, The Islam and the Pan-Abrahamic Problem. Joshua Sijuwade is a visiting lecturer at the London School of Theology, UK. His general interests fall into the areas of metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and analytic theology. He is the author of Analytic Theism, a philosophical investigation, The Rational Ontological Argument, Modality, Ontology, and God, and A Rational Faith, an introduction to the philosophy of Richard Swinburne. Thank you, Joshua, for being with me today.
No, thank you very much, Hunter. I'm very glad that you invited me on. Thank you.
Yeah. So, basically, my last video on the channel, I sent it to you, was exactly on your essay. And so, this is such a wonderful opportunity to speak to you, because obviously, I had a lot to say on your essay. I agree with it a lot. And what I did in my video, if people haven't seen it, was I basically took it and I said, hey, this fits my research on Islamic universalism. And so, but yeah, today we're going to discuss your philosophical contributions to the field on this. So, one of the things that you focus on in your essay is that this thesis by the historian of Islam, Fred Donner, in his 2010 book. May you explain the relevancy of this to your essay?
Yes, so the specific thesis that I was looking at was a thesis put forward by Donna in a very influential work. And in this specific work that he put forward, Muhammad and the Believers, he was putting forward a thesis that I and other people have termed the Pan-Abrahamic thesis, which is just a simple idea that the early community of followers of Prophet Muhammad were made up of different monotheistic traditions. So, in the traditional narrative, you had this idea that there were sort of, we can call them ex-pagans, who then became what we can now term Quranic monotheists, and then later they're termed Muslims. And these ex-pagans who then became Muslims made up the whole community of followers of Prophet Muhammad. And so the only individuals who were followers of Prophet Muhammad were those who submitted to the Quranic revelation. They used to be pagans, they converted, and they subscribed to the central tenet of Tawheed
Mm.
and following submitting to Muhammad. And then they took on their identity as Muslims. And they were Quranic monotheists in the sense that they were following the Quranic revelation. But Donner sort of counteracts his thesis by saying, actually, what from the specific evidence that he's looked at, and that is literary evidence, so documentary evidence, he looks at epigraphic evidence, and things related to that. And he puts forward the idea that actually the community that Muhammad had established, this was in Mecca slash Medina, was actually made up of those individuals that I spoke about, these ex-pagans, we can call them, as I said, Quranic monotheists, but then also the followers of Muhammad, in a certain sense, were also certain Christians and certain Jews. So the community of the followers of Muhammad were actually a coalition of different monotheistic traditions. And so he terms this the believers movement.
Hmm.
And yeah, so the key sort of idea here, he says, is that actually there was an inclusivity of different monotheistic traditions within the community that followed Muhammad, instead of an exclusivity. Only those who followed the Quranic revelation, that's the exclusive position. But no, you could follow the Quranic revelation, you could follow the Christian revelation, you could follow the Judaic revelation, as long as you affirmed monotheism, you believed in judgment. So judgment day was upon the community and the world. And then also you focused on performing good deeds, then salvation and inclusion within the community would be made available to you.
Wow, that's really interesting. So when you're talking about this evidence that he draws on, is any of it based on the Quran?
Yes, so he does actually look to the Quran as being one of the primary sources of his evidence. And what he sort of sees, one specific example, is that he sees the terminology that's used to refer to the members of his community within the Quran. Normally, you would think that, okay, the Quran, when it's referring to the followers of Muhammad, they would be called Muslims because they are submitting to the will of Allah. But actually, what's the more prevalent term that is used in reference to them is that of the term believers. So instead of them being simply referred to those as submitters, so being Muslims, what was the key identifying factor of someone who followed Allah through the leadership of Prophet Muhammad was that they were believers, believers in the past revelations that God had given, and they were submitters to the will of Allah. So what this meant is that according to the Quranic evidence, the term Muslim was something which was more flexible. So it could actually be applied to not just simply the Quranic monotheists, but it could also be applied to those who were Christians or those who were Jews. Someone was simply who was following the revelation that Allah had given, such as the Injil or the gospel revelation for Christians. They could be classed as Muslims so long as they submitted to this, the oneness of God, and also the importance of Judgment Day. So the Quran is very, very influential in Donna's argument. Specifically, as I was saying to you, the frequency that you see the term believers rather than that of Muslims. But then also he sees certain other things which seem to indicate this idea of an inclusive nature to the community. He sees things like salvific inclusivity being very well emphasized in the Quranic narrative. So, for example, just I've got the verse in front of me here. He will look to verses such as Surah 262 or Surah 569, which speaks about the salvation, the reward of salvation being given to those who are Christians, those who are Jews. It also uses this more difficult in identifying who they are, but the Sabians as well. And so he uses this terminology to saying that the reward will be given to them so long as they affirm monotheism. And then he also sees as again the key idea that what was needed to be a follower of Allah was having genuine faith. That's what's really upheld in the Quran. And submitting to the outward expression of that, the adherence to the faith. But it did not mean that you had to be just a believer in the restricted revelation that was coming from Muhammad. And so, yeah, the Quran does play a big part in its frequency of the terminology it uses and the inclusivity of the passages, the passages that speak about salvific inclusivity.
Hmm. Um, to my knowledge, there's also this document called the Constitution of Medina, which was played a role for him. I'm not too familiar with it, but what I do know is that it involves this sort of communitarian inclusivity of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Can you explain more about how that plays into the role?
Yeah, so when the Hijrah had occurred, so this was when there was migration from Mecca because of persecution of the followers of Muhammad, the believers community,
Mhm.
and then they sort of went on the Hijrah. They migrated to Medina. They were accepted among the community, and Muhammad specifically was accepted among the community because he had been seen as an ideal leader. People had looked to him in Medina, and they sent people to actually invite him over because they wanted him to sort of operate as a mediator within the community because he was effective at that type of skill. And so then one of the documents that he formulated was what was called, or what is called now, the Constitution of Medina, or another term is the Ummah document. And in this document, what it states and what it focuses on is more about the unity of the people who are in Medina. But specifically, it does focus more on the Jews because the population of Jews was a lot more than Christians.
Mhm.
And so you do have it speaking that the Jews will be counted amongst the followers of Muhammad. And so you see them being included within this. They should be treated in an equal manner to the followers of Muhammad. They will also fight alongside the followers of Muhammad. And then you also have Christians, some Christians who are living in that area. Some people looked at certain evidence indicating that they were also included within this. It was more of an informal inclusion. So it wasn't as explicitly stated, but they were also included within this. But this was a constitution, a document which was expressing, in a way, a legal protection to the unity of the people in that area.
Hmm.
And so what it does, this document, is that it sort of pushes against the narrative that Muhammad had a disdain for those who are outside of his own community. So normally the traditional narrative has sort of over time Muhammad had sort of a growing disdain towards, for example, certain Jewish tribes, certain Christians, and he even expelled certain Jews from the land. But what you see with the Constitution of Medina, which is a very strong form of evidence for a lot of people and in support of Donna's thesis, is that it actually shows that Muhammad had a desire for unity. He had a desire to actually form, in a political way, a coalition of different people. And so it sort of provides a sort of additional form of evidence alongside the Quran to say that actually the way that Muhammad had been instructed by Allah and what he believed Allah was giving him was a mandate to bring unity of different traditions together under the one God.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Yeah, yeah, okay, okay. So this historical evidence makes a lot of sense then. So taking this evidence, where do you fit yourself into the conversation? Because I know you're a philosopher, right? So
Yeah,
do
yeah.
you, yeah,
Yeah.
philosophize the situation?
Yeah, so exactly. My contribution, a lot more limited than obviously Donna's own.
Hmm.
I'm building on his historical work. So when people are maybe trying to critique the argument I'm giving, you have to keep in mind that I'm not the person who's done the
Yeah,
historical work.
yeah.
I'm dependent upon that the historical work that's been put forward. But something I will say before I go into my own philosophical
Hmm.
contribution, that Donna's contribution has been seen as a mainstream thesis.
Oh
So
yeah.
it's not a thesis on the edge of scholarship.
Yeah, I in a footnote in my book, I refer to it as the bedrock of current
Yes,
Islamic scholarship.
yes,
It
exactly.
really is. When you look at anything published after 2010, you're going
Yes,
to find honor cited in one way
yes,
or another. So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
So, given that, then I sort of had a little thinking about this. What are the philosophical implications of what Donna had argued for? Let's say we take, for example, that Donna is saying that there is this coalition of different faith traditions, monotheistic traditions, and Muhammad had established a community of Christians, of Jews, of Quranic monotheists. Then how does this fit with the community of the followers of Muhammad of
Mm,
today? Because what Muslims will say today, they would say that their community is in continuity. It is the community that
mm,
was established by Muhammad. So it could be Sunnis, it could be Shiites, it could be other forms of Islam, but they would see themselves as the direct successors of the community that Muhammad has established and was further developed by the caliphs that came after him. But then the sort of philosophical challenge that I give is to sort of show that actually, given certain criteria to given certain criteria that can be utilized in identifying groups or organizations over time, it seems like the modern day community cannot actually hold on to the claim of being the same community as Prophet Muhammad.
mm,
So, in further fleshing this out, I utilized the work of Richard Swinburne, so a very eminent philosopher of religion. And in one of his works, the specific work being Revelation, he puts forward this criteria for identifying the continuity and connectedness of organizations over time. So, sort of fleshing this out in a mundane example.
mm,
So if I have Oxford University, and I want to know, let's say Oxford University, which was started, let's say in the 11th century, and also, and if I want to know that the Oxford from the 11th century is the same Oxford as today, then I need to utilize a criteria that allows me to understand that they've maintained some form of identity. Because if we don't have a criteria to identify things over time, then anything can make a claim to be the same thing as something that came before it. So, for example, Michael Jackson passed away. Well, I can claim today that I'm Michael Jackson.
mhm.
Well, even though he was a great singer, people will be able to utilize a criteria to say, it doesn't seem like you are the same person. And normally it would be to do with things with DNA, with psychological connectedness, with certain things that we can prove. And so we can do the same thing with organizations. So Swinburne puts forward this criteria and says we need to look to continuity and connectedness of the aims and organization of a community. So if I have Oxford from the 11th century and I have Oxford from the 21st century, the Oxford from the 21st century is the same university as the 11th century version, only if it upholds the same aims as the 11th century Oxford, and it also is organized in the same way. So Oxford from the 21st century has the aim of educating people to a very high standard,
Mhm.
providing exceptional level of academic fulfillment and flourishment. And so the idea here is there's an aim that seems to be the same aim that the Oxford that was started in the 11th century had. But then let's say that we had the Oxford from the 21st century deciding that they're no longer going to provide an educational experience for their students. They're going to instead sell them shoes. They're going to change into a shoe shop, and now they're going to be, selling shoes to their students instead of teaching them. Well, people will obviously start dropping out and say, this isn't Oxford. What's happened? The companies bought them out and started selling shoes. And so they would say that it's not the same Oxford. The Oxford that used to educate no longer exists because it's not doing the same thing as the one in the past used to do. But it's not just the aims of the organization which needs to be the same, but also the way that it's structured. It needs to be structured in a very similar way. Now, this doesn't mean that there can't be evolution to an organizational structure, but it has to be very piecemeal. If there is a sudden change to the organizational structure of something, then it seems that it's going to disrupt that specific thing. It's not going to be the same thing anymore. So, if, for example, instead of having lecturers, professors, fellows, and all those people that make up Oxford, Oxford is now going to have a CEO of a company. It's now going to have managing directors. It's now going to have a board of directors. It's going to have shareholders. It's going to have stakeholders. It's going to have employees that are selling things. So they're going to have sales assistants. So if they just change the structure, the way that it operates now into a corporate structure from an academic institution, then we're going to say again that doesn't seem to be the same organization anymore from the one that it was in the past. So what you need to uphold over time is aims and the organization of the specific latter organization. So then taking this into account, I then say, okay, maybe then I can utilize this in the Islamic context. Now, it wasn't me who utilized this criteria first in the religious context. Swinburne did this himself, but he restricted it just to Christian organizational identity. But I said, actually, this can be utilized in a wider sense in an Islamic context or in other religions to see if a community is the same over time. And so then I said, okay, let's say we take Donna's thesis, and one of the core doctrinal tenets of the community was salvific inclusivism, that you can be part of the members of you can be part of the saved members of society, even if you are not a Quranic monotheist. So even if you do not hold to the Quran as your revelation that you submit to, so long as you hold to a past revelation of God, and you also uphold the oneness of God and Judgment Day and good works, then salvation is made available to you. So it's not just saying my five prayers, it's not just following the sunnah of the Prophet. I don't need to do that. That's for the Quranic monotheist to access salvation. But as a Christian, I can even access salvation myself within my own Christian framework. And so salvific inclusivism is what Donna was pushing forward and saying that is an identifying doctrine, an aim of that organization. Join our organization, Muhammad will say, and salvation will be made available to you no matter what tradition you are. And then I said, okay, well, if we look at the doctrine of salvation within the contemporary Muslim context, do we see an upholding of this specific doctrinal tenet? And we do not. We
Yeah.
see the opposite being affirmed. We have the idea of salvific exclusivism, that salvation is only available to those who follow the Quranic revelation. So even if you follow the past revelation of Christianity or the past revelation of Judaism with the Torah, salvation is not made available to you anymore. So it seems like this core salvific tenet, this core doctrine, is not affirmed at all in the contemporary community. So that means then that we have a lack of continuity and connectedness of this specific doctrinal aim.
Hmm.
So even though we might have Tawheed still being upheld, even though we might have other doctrinal things being upheld, salvation is another key doctrine and it's a fundamental one. So if that's not being upheld anymore, we don't have the community that Muhammad's been putting forward. But
Mhm.
then I also say it's not just to do with the doctrinal aim. We also can look at the organizational structure being different for the two communities. With the previous community, the community established by Muhammad, it seems to be that Muhammad established a community that, as I said before, included other members.
Hmm.
So it's not just salvation that's available here, but you can follow me and you can be part of the people of God, even if you are a Christian. So you can be part of the people of God as a Christian. You can be part of the people of God as a Jew. You can be part of the people of God as a Quranic monotheist. So the membership was pluralistic or inclusive again. You had this idea that different forms of the monotheistic traditions were the part of the members. But then when we look at the contemporary community, we then have what can be termed theological exclusivity, that you only have those being part of the members of the Ummah, the modern day community, if they are submitting to the Quran. But if you submit to the Christian revelation, you are not part of our community. You cannot be a member. So there's a restriction of the membership of the community here. So what we have is a different form, a different organizational structure. And the way we can sort of see this visually is if the prophet was to be alive today, and he was to go and say, well, where are my people?
Hmm.
And he goes to a local masjid and he only sees Quranic monotheists, then he will say, well, where are the Christians? Where are the other members? Are they not here anymore? Oh, you say they can't even be saved as well. So it seems like there is two different communities that are existing, one in the past and one now in the present day, which doesn't seem to have a continuity and connectedness of the doctrinal aims with salvation and the organizational structure with the membership.
Mhm.
So this seems, according to what I put forward, that they are not the same communities. It seems to be that the community that Muhammad had put forward has gone out of existence. And
Yeah.
this is a radical conclusion. It seemed to cease to exist. The same way that Oxford ceased to exist when it became a corporate entity, in my example, it seems that Muhammad's community ceased to exist at a certain point in time. And the way that I sort of just put the dating is more with Donna's idea
Mhm.
that it was through the work of Abdul Malik in the latter half of the 7th century that that's where the change occurred and that's where the community went out of existence.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. It has my mind thinking a lot.
Yeah.
Um, that's really good. That's really good. A couple of points I think that I kind of want to make. So regarding this continuity thesis, do you think that although this sort of began in Swinburne's book Revelation, which I highly recommend for everybody to read if you haven't, it's a wonderful kind of text on how Revelation works and maybe a more rational approach to understanding how Revelation. Um, do you think that this can be turned back on Christians? There's this common, well, it used to sort of just be an atheist thing, but now that Islam's kind of growing in its internet presence, you'll hear this sort of thing that Christianity was started by Paul, right? So the question could be, does this argument hurt Christians? And because in that sense, if Paul started Christianity and Paul isn't, we see Jesus as the founder of Christianity, but Paul is, this is sort of the Malik of Christianity at that point, right? Do you think that this can be kind of turned back on Christians?
Oh yeah. So the good
Hmm.
thing, and it's a plus of the thesis
Hmm.
that it's not ad hoc. So it
Yeah.
wasn't just made for a specific religion.
Yeah.
It can be utilized by any religion to
Hmm.
try and identify if the community is the same. So if someone was to formulate it and apply it to Christians, then it would apply to Christianity in the same way that it does with Islam.
Hmm.
I would push back and say I don't think it can be done in the same way
Hmm.
for Christianity as it can be done with Islam. Because the thesis, let's say we go with the Pauline thesis you put forward, that specific thesis is not a mainstream thesis. So
Yeah.
what I mean by that is it's not a thesis that is affirmed by in the same way that Donna's thesis has become a
Yeah.
fundamental thesis. So it's something you hear a lot. It's a trope you hear
Yeah.
a lot. especially on the internet. Oh, Paul started it. But actually, what is the textual evidence that a lot of scholars would say when they do, for example, historical Jesus studies
Yes.
and big field of that? You wouldn't really start from Paul in constructing
Hmm.
the formulation of Christianity. You will go with the person of Jesus, and you
Yeah.
would say, yes, Paul was very instrumental in the spreading of Christianity. And maybe you might have some arguments so for certain ideas about developments about the idea of Gentile inclusion and things like
Hmm.
that. But what someone could push back again and say is there is a lot of mainline scholarship that shows that actually this was so from people like Larry Hurtado, very good
Hmm.
the Lord Jesus Christ, where he sort of really tries to argue that actually things like an early high Christology
Hmm.
was something which seems to be the biblical sort of standpoint. So it wasn't a later development.
Hmm.
So someone could do it, and maybe there are ways, and I'd love to hear people applying it to Christianity. But it will be interesting to see where sort of the mainline scholarship lands on things, so to sort of empower the argument. Where I where I will say that it can be used quite effectively,
Hmm.
it's more to do with the identification of what Christian group is the Christian community that Christ established.
Yes.
So Swinburne himself didn't do this in impersonal
Yeah.
conversation with myself. He was saying the reason why he didn't do that is because it would have affected the readership of the Revelation book.
Hmm.
But he was very clear that he believes that they can be applied to identify if,
Interesting.
for example, Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Protestantism is actually the one that has continuity and connectedness. And so I will actually tell people to keep their eyes open because I do have an article coming out that does apply that in that way. So that's something that will come out in the future.
It's very interesting. Yes, Swinburne himself is Orthodox, right? And so, as am I.
Yeah.
Um, in his private conversation with you about this, did he say that Orthodoxy is the one
Yes.
true? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yes. And to sort of
Hmm.
reveal things, this
Yeah.
is probably the first time I revealed it. It might be a shock to yourself.
Sure.
I was actually recently received into the Orthodox
Oh,
Church.
God bless. That's
And
awesome.
that
Yeah.
was in the Antiochian jurisdiction,
Nice.
and it was early April.
Hmm.
And you're the first person online that I've told.
Wow. Thank you.
Um, no, it's fine. But it's actually because of this, which is very interesting.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
the article that I've written is applying this to this issue, and I just
Okay.
felt, given the weight of evidence, it
Hmm.
showed that continuity and connectedness did actually sort of indicate that Eastern Orthodoxy, the Orthodox Church, is the one that has that identification with the early community established by Christ. So
Wow.
yeah, Swinburne did it, but he didn't sort of flesh it out. I did my own sort of article, really put more rigorous sort of
Mm.
historical weight to this argument. So yeah, yeah, definitely.
So now that I hear that you're talking about this, you're reading the scholarship and stuff, do you, I guess to kind of discuss this, this is a very fascinating point. Do you engage with the arguments, which are, I would say, are really mainline at this point, that the episcopacy didn't really develop a bishop-based ecclesiology until Ignatius of Antioch in the early second century, and
Yeah.
this would get into a whole idea of dating the letters, right? The pastoral letters mention bishops. Um, First Timothy does explicitly, and so someone would say, well, First Timothy mentions bishops, therefore it has to be past Ignatius because we know that Ignatius is the first to mention bishops. So do you sort of engage with this? Because I consider myself a pretty for someone that is religious, I would be considered a pretty critical scholar of Christianity. But at the same time, I'd very interested in seeing a case against the idea that the episcopacy developed in the second century. So do you engage with that at all?
Yeah, so I do
Hmm.
actually, which is interesting. So I'll just sort of
Okay.
give you a very short snippet of what the
Sure.
article is like. But the idea here is that I believe that orthodoxy over that of Catholicism
Hmm.
and Protestantism, but I'll just stick with Catholicism because it's lot,
Hmm.
a lot harder task to show that
Yes.
than Protestantism. But what I argue for is that the aims and the organization of Roman Catholicism doesn't fit with what we have from the first millennium. So if we take the community now and we
Hmm.
have which is grounded upon the papacy,
Hmm.
um, which is to do so that's the organizational structure. It's papal as such. And we take the early community of the millennium.
Hmm.
What I argue is that I don't argue. So what I do argue for is that the papacy had a transformation. So I sort of take the scholarship that's been done, which actually says that the papacy itself, so not the episcopacy, I don't really argue for against the episcopacy itself being late.
Mm,
What I do try and show is that the papacy is something which was established by Christ. So I do hold to that.
hmm
Um, but the way it was operating was always in a consensus-based way.
hmm
So in the first millennium, it was not operating with supremacy as
Yeah.
an ideal. It was not operating with infallibility as an
Yeah.
ideal. It
Yeah.
was operating, yes, with primacy,
hmm
and primacy was an important thing, and it was more weighty primacy than just primacy of honor.
hmm
But it was
Agreed.
always consensus-based primacy. That the
Yeah.
same way that decisions were not made just by the Pope alone, and he didn't have jurisdictional rights over other sees as such. And so then what I argue then is it goes into the 10th century, into the 11th century, specifically with the Gregorian reforms, that you then have, similar to Abdul Malik, this transformation
Mm,
of the papacy from it being a consensus-based organization as such, or primacy, to them being a supremacy-based one. So what I say is actually there's a lack of continuity with this organizational structure because there was this transformation, radical transformation that occurred after the first millennium. But then what I also argue for is for the doctrinal aims being different. And it's not to do with the papacy, but it's actually to do with the doctrine of God. So something that, for those who have looked into my work, I've done quite a bit of work on the Trinity. And specifically, I've focused a lot on the monarchy of the Father.
hmm
And the idea that the one God is identified as the Father. And even though the Son and the Spirit are still divine, the idea is that the one God is the Father because he's the fundamental divine person. The Son and the Spirit are still divine and homoousios with the Father, but they lack fundamentality because the Son is eternally generated and the Son eternally proceeds from the Father. So they are not fundamental, yet they are still divine. But to be God in the sense of ho theos, the God, that's a being who is fundamental, and that applies to the Father alone.
hmm
So then what I say is that I try to show and argue that this was the conciliar position that you find within the first millennium, which was expressed in Nicaea and Constantinople, and then upheld through Ephesus and Chalcedon and the other Constantinoples, and then Nicaea too at the end. And so what you have is then later on, Roman Catholicism was affirming this in the first millennium because there was no pushback on the idea that the one God is the Father from a conciliar standpoint, and from the consensus of the fathers. But then what you have is in the starting sort of with Augustine in the fourth century, but then really when we get into the Council of Florence, you have a first identification as the one God as the Trinity.
hmm
So it says that it says the Trinity. I think if I'm correct, I forgot it off the top of my mind. But the one God, Father, Son, and Spirit is Almighty, and blah blah blah. And it sort of is. I show how it's actually very similar to the Nicene beginning. The Nicene Creed says we believe in the one God, the Father.
hmm
What it says here is that we believe in the one God, Father, Son, and Spirit.
mm
So what we have here is that the one God, who is the God, is now changed from being the Father to being the tripersonal being, the Father, Son, and Spirit. So what we have here again is a transformation, and so there is not doctrinal community. There's not doctrinal continuity, and so again, and you can see this throughout the works. Like it's very rare that you'll see people saying the one God is the Father. Very rare.
Wow.
Now, especially in the Western half of the world, if you go to a Protestant church, which comes from
hmm
Catholicism, you go to Catholicism, they'll always be saying Father, Son, and Spirit. God is
Yeah.
tripersonal, God is triune. You're one God, three in one. And so there's that transformation that's really become the standard teaching. But was that the teaching of Scripture? And was that the teaching of the conciliar declarations and the fathers? And I argue that it's not. So then what you have here is that you have, again, lack of doctrinal
Yep.
continuity and connectedness. So then what this means is that what you have with Rome, what you have with Orthodoxy is, and then I show Orthodoxy has upheld these things. Orthodoxy has upheld the sort of consensus-based approach to authority through the episcopacy. So I do speak on the episcopacy actually, and I do push back a little bit, but it's not a big aspect of it, just because it's a very long article.
Hmm.
And then I do show also that orthodoxy is upheld through not so much the modern day sort of conciliar approach,
Hmm.
but through a lot of eminent theologians who have
Yes.
gone back and upheld and affirmed that actually, no, the one God is the Father. So you have orthodoxy having this kept alive within its teaching. So that's why then we can say actually the one God, sorry, the identification of the community that was established by Christ seems to be residing within the Orthodox Church. So yeah, it's a
Wow.
very long article, and it's just going through the stages of review. Hopefully, you'll be get through that soon. It's been going on since November, and
Yeah.
you know how journal articles work. So yeah, it takes time, but hopefully it'll be out,
Yeah.
and then I'll be posting, and hopefully people will be able to see more about it.
Yeah, wow, that sounds awesome. Okay, perfect. All right. Yeah, this has me thinking a lot about yeah, if I could just get your quick thoughts. We only have about 4 minutes till
Yes,
this
yeah,
will
yeah,
end,
yeah,
but
that's fine. Yeah.
if I could just hear some quick
Yes.
thoughts, thinking about Swinburne's idea of this continuity thesis, how do you think it would apply to sort of studying ancient Gnosticism? That's currently what I'm working on, is sort of a study of ancient Gnosticism. Do you see? I mean, I don't know how familiar if you've read the Gnostic texts and stuff, but just on your basic knowledge of Gnosticism or more, perhaps, um, do you see this continuity problem with Gnosticism between the different ancient sects? Like, there's these theological doctrinal aims of Gnosticism, let's say, right? And throughout the, let's say, second to fourth century, you have all these different groups that call themselves Gnostics, and they seem to have these similar doctrinal aims. Would you say that that sort of follows the continuity, and that we could say that this is a sort of deified group? And
Yeah. Yeah. So
Mhm.
I have to say that I don't have knowledge
Okay,
at all.
that's
I've
fair.
got a very basic knowledge of
Sure.
what Gnosticism is and sort of it. So I wouldn't be able to tell you from sort of a the conceptual basis.
Yeah, yeah.
But what I would say is that if you can see that there is, because I would just emphasize that there is a difference between continuity and connectedness. So there
Mm.
are two
Hmm.
sort of criteria. So continuity is the idea of is there a is there the same thing that's being taught
Hmm.
or being structured from one group to another?
Yeah.
Then connectedness is there successor links linking the original community to the other one? So, for
Yeah,
example,
there
if you
are.
just have
Yeah.
a community that
Mhm.
went out of existence and then popped into existence 1,000
Yeah.
years later, so aka someone might argue Protestantism, then you would have, or with a lot of the restorationist sort of
Hmm.
doctrines, then you'll have a problem of connectedness because there isn't that sort of connectedness of
Hmm.
community of an organization. So how can we say that they are the same thing? So what I would say is that maybe try and look and say, well, if they are, look at the fundamental doctrines and say, well, what are the fundamental doctrines of the ancient Gnostics and the group that you're trying to look at?
Yeah.
And well, what can we whittle down to the fundamentals?
Yeah.
Are they teaching the fundamental things that the first group taught?
Yeah.
And are they structured in a similar way? Now, it doesn't have to be exactly the same.
Hmm.
Again, there can be small piecemeal evolutions to this, but it can't be radically changing
Hmm.
the structure. And
That's
then,
great.
are there successor groups? Is one of the groups? Can you see groups that a chain of links that goes from one group to the other? Then, if you have those sort of two criteria being met, then you can say one of the groups, or even more than one of the groups, are the successor groups, because
Hmm.
maybe the two groups are splintered, but they're still identifiable as them. Then you'll be able to say that's the case. So, yeah, the only advice I can give you is probably the working out of the
Yeah.
criteria itself, but actually the nuts and bolts of what is actually the content that I'm sorry, yeah, I just don't know enough about it.
Yeah. That's totally cool. Well, just want to thank you for coming on the channel. I'm going to go ahead and put all your links in the description. I'll put your recent Islamic article. I'll also put a link to your book and your Facebook if you'd like that.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your great questions, and it
Mhm.
was a joy to speak to you. Thank you so much, Hamza.
Great. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
God bless.
God bless.